In our last session, we spoke to the question, how do I respond when I'm wronged? And what we saw is that the way of Jesus is to love our enemies, to meet evil with good, to try and do good for those who do us wrong. Implied in this idea is forgiveness, that when we're wronged, we choose to release the other people from what we feel like their wrong has caused them to owe us. And today, we're going to build on this idea by asking this question. What if I don't feel like I can forgive a person for what they've done to me? This is another tough one, and in one corner, we have our larger culture, which in recent decades has been having a deteriorating relationship with the idea of forgiveness. In the last 2 decades, our culture has steadily had a shifting perspective on the inherent worth of forgiveness. With our recent awakenings to the pervasive evil of sexual assault and the continuing traumas of racism in our culture, many people have begun to question whether forgiveness is even a good thing at all. In an article in the New York Times on whether forgiveness is a good thing or not for those who have suffered sexual assault, one commentator said, "Insisting on forgiveness plays into the sickness of patriarchal, misogynistic, male supremacist religions that blame women. Forgiveness heals neither the body or mind. Let the criminal ask his gods, if there be any, for forgiveness." Instead of talking about victims who must forgive, we should be talking about tattooing the words rapist or sexual predator on the foreheads of criminals. This might actually make women and children safer. Now, this is an extreme example, but the argument is not uncommon. The argument goes that insisting on forgiveness empowers the perpetrators of wrong, especially wrongs against women and minorities. And to say that forgiveness is the right thing to do creates a world where people can continue to rape and abuse and discriminate without being held accountable for their actions. Even in some collegiate settings, forgiveness is being discouraged by counseling professors. They say things like, when people are treated cruelly by others and you tell them they must forgive, you've introduced a new hurt into an already hurting person, and you increase the likelihood of forgiveness being a way for those who abuse power to maintain their position of abuse. In less extreme circumstances, we see this influence the way popular culture counsels us to treat those who hurt us. We hear the language of cutting off toxic people from our lives, or choosing to disassociate from family members who have hurt us with their political views, or even with so-called cancel culture, where the interpersonal wrongdoings of people are made public for all the world to see and what they've done. These are all ways in which our culture is telling us that when we are hurt or angry and feeling like we're not able to get past it, instead of forgiving, we should cut people out of our lives and make those who hurt us pay for their actions, and do all within our power to help the world see how terrible of a person they are. This is where it becomes so important for us to understand what the biblical teaching on forgiveness truly is, because some of the beliefs I just mentioned are reactions against the way that the church has dealt with forgiveness in ways that have actually caused harm. There have been people who have been taught a view of forgiveness that has led them into more hurt and has kept those who need to be held accountable from being held accountable. But that does not mean that the Bible's teachings on forgiveness are wrong. There is way more in the Bible about forgiveness than we can cover in this short video, but here is something to get us started. This is Luke 17, starting in verse 3. Jesus says, "If your brother or sister sins against you, rebuke them, and if they repent, forgive them. Even if they sin against you 7 times in a day, and 7 times come back to you saying, 'I repent,' you must forgive them." Jesus gives 2 important instructions. The first is that when someone sins against you, you rebuke them. And rebuke is a word that means to confront. This is so important because it helps us see that forgiveness is not just letting others do whatever they want to and you taking it and trying to forget that it happened. Forgiveness does not keep us from confronting the wrongs done against us. Instead, confronting and forgiving go hand in hand, And we see that because the second instruction here is to forgive. Confronting the offenses of those who wrong us and forgiving them are meant to go together. Tim Keller gives some extremely important insight into this. He says, the goal of forgiveness is primarily neither inner healing nor payback to the offender. Forgiveness can bring inner healing and can be part of the pursuit of justice, but the ultimate purpose of forgiveness is the restoration of community. What he's saying is that by placing the need to confront wrongs alongside the need to forgive wrongs, Jesus is asking us to be the type of people who don't empower others to continue their abuses, but rather confront those abuses, but also not to confront with an intention to humiliate and insult and dehumanize, but rather with the intention to correct and restore and bring about change that is good for the individual and the community. Forgiveness is the only way that this can happen. Because if I'm carrying around a desire to make people pay for what they've done to me, it's very hard to confront in a way that loves rather than in a way that hurts. This is also why forgiveness and insisting upon consequences for the offender are not mutually exclusive. Because in forgiveness, consequences can be pursued in terms of love and the good of the community rather than in terms of retribution. Here's the hard part of this. We live in an incredibly broken world where things rarely go like we want them to. When I confront someone for their offense, it usually isn't received well, even when I do so in a loving way. That's why it's helpful to think of forgiveness as being in two aspects. The first aspect is what happens inside of me. When I choose to forgive someone, I'm saying that I'm going to absorb the cost of the wrong so that I will not need to demand repayment for the wrong committed against me. You know, we seek repayment in so many forms. It could be an angry outburst, it could be a silent treatment, it could be gossiping about a person. Whatever it is, there are all sorts of ways we try and make people pay for what they've done to us. Inward forgiveness is the part of forgiveness where I consciously choose not to make the other person pay for what they've done. But then there's also the outward part of forgiveness, which is where relationships are reconciled. This is where I try to restore the relationship that has been damaged. When it comes to forgiveness in this life, the first aspect of forgiveness is in your control. The second aspect, it's not. There are things that happen in ways people respond that make total reconciliation just not possible. And so while we want both to happen, it's just not always the case. And oftentimes, especially when the offender has not admitted they're wrong and has not tried to make things right, we often get stuck in the emotional cycles of not feeling like forgiveness has happened. That person has still hurt you. They have made no indications of trying to make things right, and you are hurt. And that anger and pain that you're feeling, it's not going anywhere, which makes us feel like, have I even forgiven them? And we ask the question, well, what if I don't feel like forgiveness has happened? Well, here's the thing to remember. Feelings are not forgiveness. We can choose to not make the other person pay for their actions and still have these complex and difficult emotions to work through. We can forgive in the first aspect and still have to process all of the emotions that come from being hurt. I can make that decision to forgive while still feeling hurt and broken. That's why this differentiation of the two aspects of forgiveness is so helpful, because the first aspect, it's a choice that we can all make. And sometimes our emotions will follow, but sometimes they won't. We can still make that choice to forgive, though. The second aspect of forgiveness, it doesn't always occur, and that's oftentimes out of our control. The brokenness of those relationships that doesn't get restored, they're oftentimes what make us feel that ongoing pain. And that's something that we end up needing to process over the long term. And that's okay. If you're struggling to get past some of the emotions and hurt and pain of broken relationships, that's normal. So why would I choose pardon over punishment? The answer is this. Trying to make others pay for their wrongs rarely brings about the changes we hope to see, But when I forgive and am able to confront and seek justice in love rather than in retribution, it's not only the way of Jesus, but it's the way that we seek the most good for the most people. We'll see you next week.